If the US accepts Iran controlling the Strait of Hormuz, then in essence, this is the start of the ending of the US empire, in the same way that the British Empire ended when they couldn't protect the Suez Canal. And suddenly, people realized that the British Empire was weak and it could be challenged. Now here, the US cannot even open a 50-kilometer wide gap in the waters by what the world knows as the biggest, most powerful navy in the world, apparently, which is the US. But it's not about just people challenging the US. It's also an attack on the dollar being reserve currency. America entered into a deal with the Gulf countries that they have to sell their oil in dollars, which is known as the petrodollars. The reason for that is that the Gulf countries get security for that arrangement, and the US ensures that there's a huge demand for dollar because people who want to buy oil have to have dollars to buy that oil from the Gulf countries. Now, a lot of that surplus of dollars, whether sitting in the Gulf countries or sitting in other countries that are buying the oil, is not just kept in the country, it's reinvested back in the US economy. It's used to buy US debt, US treasuries, which ensures that the interest rate of the US government is low because there's a huge demand of dollar and therefore a huge demand of US debt that they want to invest in, because otherwise there's no point of holding just dollar. It loses value because of inflation. So countries would invest in the US debt to get an interest rate, and that because there's a high demand for US debt, the US government doesn't have to pay a high interest rate because there's a lot of people demanding it. And so they keep a low interest rate, which allows the US government to borrow 40 trillion in debt and still function without going bankrupt, and which funds the military. But Iran can challenge that because now it can say that, oh, do you want a faster transit or approval through the Strait of Hormuz? Because all the entries or the exit, whatever they agree, has to be approved by Iran, and they have to go through the Iranian government authority or the Hormuz authority. Well, if you want a faster approval, you have to confirm that the cargo has been bought not by dollar, but maybe by Chinese yuan. That will ensure that you go faster. And so that means more people are going to buy oil, not in dollar, but in Chinese yuan to ensure that their products leave faster, especially when there's an oil shock where there isn't enough oil. People want to get their oil as quickly as possible. And so if by Iran controlling that, it can ensure that people use less dollar, and so less people hold dollar. And so it starts that process of removing the dollar as the reserve currency, especially when the security guarantees of the US don't mean anything anymore, as we've seen with this war, where in fact the US has brought destruction to the Gulf countries because of the US bases that are in those countries, where it resulted in the Gulf countries themselves protecting the US bases. So we kind of had a flip from the US protecting the Gulf countries to the Gulf countries protecting the US bases. And so that's why the US is going to struggle with getting into a long-term deal where Iran controls the Strait of Hormuz. So even if they get into an agreement, the expectation is that the US will restart the war next year when they've resupplied the oil and the inventory, when they've resupplied their ammunition.